Welcome to Off the Shelf. I'm your host, Yvonne Wolf, and today our special guest is a historian of early Illinois, an advocate for heirloom plants, and a retired lawyer, John Swenson. Welcome, John.
I'm glad to be here, Yvonne.
Well, tell us about your book, Early Chicago.
Well, my contribution to the book is a contributing editor. I wrote a number of lengthy essays and some other shorter articles for this book, which is quite compendious and is still a very reliable source for history of Chicago up to about 1835.
Yeah, I understand it's before 1800s, mostly.
Well, my specialty is really mostly before 1800 and as a matter of fact, before 1700. And I have some knowledge of what happened before history because I know something about archaeology as well.
Oh, I see. So can you tell us a little bit about your research? You say you do most of your research from local or historical societies and manuscripts. You sometimes have to handle original manuscripts.
Well, if you're looking for reliable information about early Illinois, there are a lot of books. Many of them are in French. There are a lot of manuscripts, some of which have been found and read and studied. Many of them have been misunderstood and misinterpreted, and a lot of those manuscripts have not yet been found until I found them.
Wow, sounds like a detective work.
If you think you know the answer, it's because you haven't looked hard enough.
So now these manuscripts in French, it's not modern French, right? So you can...
Well, 17th century French is, if you can read French, you can read 17th century French.
It's not as big as the difference from Middle English to...
No, not that much of a difference.
I see. And it's wonderful that you have ability to read in another language.
If I couldn't read French, I couldn't have done the work I've done.
So can you tell us a little bit about what you found?
Well, of course, the Indians were here in Illinois since maybe 12,000 years ago. But the French came to Illinois. The earliest records of them were the Joliet and Marquette expedition in 1673.
Yes.
Some of the members of that expedition stayed behind down near Joliet. Mm-hmm. And that was the first European presence that's been recorded in Illinois. The French then basically were in charge of Illinois until about 1760 when they lost the war with England. And but the French basically colonized Illinois from Canada for the most part.
Right.
And were actually some of the traders particularly were here starting in probably 1673. Then there were some French starting with LaSalle who were in the Peoria area in 1680.
So the French were mainly interested in fur trading, were they, and surveying the land?
Well, there were two basic interests that the French had. One was the commercial interest, business. The second interest was in setting up a series of basically military establishments to keep the English from taking over, because the English claimed all of what is now Illinois a little bit before the French decided they wanted it. So there was this problem of conflict, which was finally resolved by the war, what we call the French and Indian War.
Mm-hmm. And the English wanted Illinois for the same reasons, for commerce as well, or was there any?
Well, the English also, because there were a lot of furs here, which were shipped off to Europe to make felt hats for men and ladies. However, basically, it was probably more of a matter of geographical expansion.
Territorial.
Yeah, and of course, the Indians were here, they'd been here forever, and the Indians were useful until they were kicked out or deported to beyond the Mississippi. So I think it probably was commerce, yeah, was the opening salvo, but it was basically it was a land grab. As a matter of fact, there was a treaty with the English in about 1780. One of the Indian chiefs, by the way, they called themselves Indians,
Yes.
who said, it's a slight paraphrase, the American is a monster, and what it eats is land.
Interesting.
That was a basic thrust of the Europeans.
And the Indians, did they choose to side with more so with the French, or they were?
Well, the French were. The French. There was a shortage of French women in Canada and New France. So a lot of the French men especially in the Indian trade, married native women.
Right.
So that gave them a little bit of an advantage. Also, the French learned the native languages and the culture,
Yes.
and so they had a distinct advantage over the English. But the whole thing was so much more complicated than that. But what we think of is now modern Illinois started basically with Joliet in 1673, although there were probably some earlier French travelers who probably didn't leave many records.
I see. And now you say you have two manuscripts. One is about early Chicago,
Right.
but another one's about early Peoria.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thrust of both of them is that the standard histories, almost everything you will read in history books about Illinois have both Chicago and Peoria in the wrong places.
Okay.
And that's, from that point of departure, is where my contribution has lain, because I've shown by documentation where they really were originally, not now.
Oh. So they were moved. Were they moved, or they just?
No. The Chicago was originally a string of French settlements along rivers running between Joliet and what is now the mouth of the Little Calumet River at South Chicago.
I've been there.
There were huge Indian villages down there, holding thousands of people, and they were there forever. And of course, that was where the French traders wanted to go, because that's where the money was.
Yes.
When the Yankees came along, basically starting with Fort Dearborn in 1803, they decided, at that time, Chicago was about 3 log cabins. And the French had been in there along those rivers to the south since 1673. So the American authorities then decided it would be easier to use the trade route on what is now called the Chicago River because there weren't any Indians in the way. And when it came time to build the I&M, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, that northern route was an easier choice because for most of the distance from what is now Chicago down to about Joliet was not inhabited by Indians.
No.
So they didn't have to deal with Indians. They found another way to get the Indians' land from them. But so that choice of that northern route and the commercial advantages of the northern route, because it was possible to make a better harbor. Well, it's a complicated story, but in any event, to make a better, more accessible harbor,
Yes.
because there's dry land around it. The harbor down at, say, South Chicago was surrounded by marsh and so forth, and it was okay for if you were a fur trader in a canoe, but if you had a great big sailing ship,
right. You can't get
not
it.
so good.
Right, so it's not good for development geographically.
Right.
Not accessible. So so it was also easier to claim land that was probably undesirable for farming and that sort of thing.
Well, see, the United States, through a series of treaties, starting basically in 1795, well, even earlier, but by a series of treaties, began getting the Indians drunk to sign away the land that they really didn't own anyhow. But the French Chicago was basically at the mouth of the Little Calumet River. They had a fort, which was built about 1691. It's on a map. And the mission, the Jesuit mission of the Guardian Angel, which was founded in 1696. As a matter of fact, the oldest surviving book written in Illinois is a manuscript dictionary of the Miami language that was started at that mission in 1696.
I see.
It still exists.
So you say you have some background in archaeology too. Can you tell us about that?
Well, you have to understand archaeology because you're dealing with people who lived here for 12,000 years, maybe.
Yeah, 10, 15,000
So you have to be aware of these people and where they lived and where they moved to and where they didn't live,
Why did they choose not to live there?
Yeah, right. Right.
But they didn't have any written records, did they? Was the French that translated some of the, reported for them?
The French Jesuits were excellent linguists, and they created a lot of documents. As a matter of fact, I found a enormous dictionary of basically the Kaskaskia language, which is a major Indian language in Illinois. And that started in 1696, and I rediscovered that manuscript. That's a huge volume. But the linguists, the French linguists, helped considerably because they provided the interpreters until the French learned how to speak the languages, which they did very quickly. But that early Chicago, basically, the French fort was closed probably, nobody really knows exactly, but about 1702. But there were French traders, you see. And so they were, the French were really doing pretty well here. constantly battling off the not only the English but the Iroquois who wanted to come in, and because they'd trapped all the beavers out east, so they wanted to come into our country to get the beaver that the Indians were gathering, and that led to a lot of complications.
Well, it's very interesting you mentioned that the missionaries were such good linguists, because I just recently came across the fact that French missionaries also read Chinese when they went to Asia, right? And they deciphered the whole language.
Yes. Yeah, the Jesuits were great linguistic scholars wherever they went. Yeah. And some of the earliest European histories of Asia are recorded by French Jesuit missionaries. Yeah, yeah. But then so we really don't know a whole lot about Chicago history from 1702 until about the time of the Revolution. There was a lot of English activity, that is to say American, along the Mississippi River, on Cahokia, Kaskaskia, and then St. Louis and so forth. But that's not what we're talking about here. But Chicago history kind of goes dark until about the time of the Revolution. And I found a manuscript, which anybody could have found but never did, by a French traveler who's coming up the Illinois River, and he comes to Chicago, and he says, this is in 1774, and he says, all that was at the present site of Chicago, which is where, Mayor Daley's City That Works, was a small French seasonal trading post on the north bank of the river, and a small Mascoutin Indian village on the south bank. That was it. No European permanent presence, because the Europeans were living down along the Little Calumet, Thorn Creek, Butterfield Creek, Hickory Creek. And that river system is what the Illinois Indians called Chicago.
Wow.
And it's on a map. And a lot of historians know about that map, but they don't understand what it's showing. Because it shows both river systems. And it labels the southern river system as the Chicago River. And it shows the fort. So, but then Peoria, LaSalle set up his winter camp in January of 1680 at what is now East Peoria.
Okay.
Nowhere near the present city, which is on what is now called Lake Peoria, which is a wide place in the river, about 2.5 miles north of where the French settlement was. And the French were there, and then in came the Americans, people like John Kinsey's half-brother Thomas Forsyth. They came into Peoria around 1800, although English people had been along the Illinois River and in Peoria. There's English-speaking people since about 1760. But the French Peoria was much more important because it was kind of the hub of the fur trade. The traders went out mostly more from Peoria, went out in all directions to trade with
like
the Indians.
Headquarters.
Yeah, it was the gathering place for the fur trade, and so the French had to because there were a lot of French people living there in East Peoria, which is interesting. They call it East Peoria, although it was the original Peoria. But anyhow, so the French had to build a fort there. LaSalle did not build a fort there. Everybody thinks he did, and there are articles about it. There are people that have created fabulous drawings of the French fort. No, LaSalle did not build a fort. Sometime after him, much longer after him, Tonti built a fort there in 1691. So when that fort was built, then that meant that a lot of French people, and then ultimately English-speaking people, could live there, because it was dangerous to live in Indian country, because the Indians didn't want the Europeans there, except that they could get guns and metal cooking pots and cloth and so forth and so on, hardware items. But the Indians didn't want the traders particularly to come in and go past their villages, because they were afraid that the traders would sell guns to their enemies down the river. See?
I see.
As a matter of fact, there's a document evaluating the possibility of going up the Missouri River in 1760s, and the person who wrote this report said, the Indians don't want you to go up the river, so it's hard to go up there. But he says there's a time when you can't go any farther up the river, and you can't go back. Because the Indians were justifiably concerned that they would sell more guns to their enemies.
Yes.
So that was always a problem.
So after the French-Indian War, did the French that used to be in Illinois, did they go to Canada?
The French. Well, see.
They returned to France?
Well, a lot of them moved down the river to New Orleans.
Oh, yeah.
Which was then, of course, Spanish territory, but Louisiana was basically run by a bunch of French people who had already been here and knew the country. So the Spaniards were kind of the viceroys, but the French ran the government for them. But then the French returned to Canada. The last French fort was built at Peoria about 1760, and I have found the complete, a fairly extensive military dossier by the commander of that fort. It's something nobody knew existed. I found it in a French archive, and I know now the full name of this man and something of his history, and I think I know what the fort in Peoria looked like. It was pretty fancy, because there's one just like it at Massac, which this same officer built. So the French lived in their Peoria until the War of 1812, and a misguided American officer thought that the French there were siding with the Indians because, there was a lot of war going on.
Right.
And so he raided and destroyed the village at East Peoria. So the French people moved across the river to the present site. I have been hanged in effigy in Peoria for uncovering this. No. They don't like me in Peoria because I tell them they're wrong on the air and in writing.
Well, thank you, John, so much for this history lesson of early Illinois.
My pleasure, Yvonne.
And thank you for joining us, and see us next time on Off the Shelf.